Tonight on Nation to Nation, Angela Sheeshish wants the world to know her residential school story. Government is using court to get her to ask for permission to do so.
They've been putting families through the ringer and treating them most disrespectfully, and the actions do not come anywhere close to lining up with the words and the intentions of this government on reconciliation.
Legal pot is just on the horizon. Ontario First Nations want more involvement.
We feel that government needs to take another year. You need to work with us directly. There needs to be a fair share. We need set-aside, and we need investments in community safety.
Welcome to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lamourant. Angela Sheeshish is a survivor of the notorious St. Anne's Residential School in Fort Albany, Ontario. She wants the world to know her story and have it preserved by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. But Ottawa and the church currently control her testimony because of a previous settlement. So she has to go to court to get permission. NDP and Conservative members of her political panel are here to discuss it, as the issue came up in question period yesterday.
Have been forced to go back to court to interference by government lawyers. The Liberals have been fighting those survivors for years by covering up documents, by forcing them to find witnesses to verify evidence, and now they want them to pay for the court costs. Mr. Speaker, this is a re-victimization of survivors who have suffered horrific levels of abuse. When will this government commit to real partnership with survivors? Because if you ask me, Mr. Speaker, this does not seem like a real partnership.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we must never allow this dark and painful chapter of our history to be forgotten. We're encouraging all survivors to share their stories and documents with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Where an individual requests it, our government is willing to absolutely waive privilege and encourages all other entities to do exactly the same. We remain committed to bringing closure to this system.
And joining me on a shortened political panel is Conservative MP Arnold Viersen, who also sits on the Indigenous Committee for Indigenous Affairs.
Hello, Todd.
How are you doing?
Good.
And NDP MP Sheila Malcolmson. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
So we'll start off, I'm going to start off referencing yesterday's question period. Romeo Saganash, of course, got up and asked the Prime Minister a specific question about St. Anne's. What did you think of the Prime Minister's answer at the time?
I think he's got his facts wrong. You know, the government is continuing to interfere. It's re-traumatizing the families who have been through a hell of a time. I mean, it's a horrible blight on Canada's history. And for the government to refuse to allow them to use the same testimony that's been used in previous court cases, to ask them to tell their stories all over again, to interfere, and to have the government say, we're not fighting Indigenous people in court, we're the good guys, just is not borne up by the truth. It's infuriating to hear him answer in that way.
If I tried to read through the lines, it was like the government was willing to concede this, but perhaps suggesting the church might not be. I mean, what was that answer all about?
Well,
Either of you can answer that.
I mean, the government's been fighting this for years now. They've been the ones that have been putting the barriers up. And if, as of yesterday morning, they got some kind of breakthrough, that still is complete. If they did, and I don't know the story on that, it still does nothing to excuse the way that they've been putting families through the ringer and treating them most disrespectfully. And the actions do not come anywhere close to lining up with the words and the intentions of this government on reconciliation.
Now, the Conservative government, especially on this issue, has been kind of silent. I mean, why hasn't your party said more about this issue?
Well, in terms of getting the testimony forward, we definitely are in favor of the groups being able to use their own testimony in other cases. It's a bit of a privilege issue, and I know that in other cases around the world or in our country, getting your own data in some cases because of a court injunction or because of a privilege case is sometimes difficult, and we are looking at a policy around that in even more broader instances. So this particular case, I think, I don't know why the government's standing in the way. The particular individual wants it. I'm sure that there's ministerial exemption that can be given, and this particular case can be eradicated easily. And to why they're fighting them, we're not sure. In the more broader context, it is always interesting that when we end up with cases where people cannot use their own testimony from one place to bring it to another, that's something that we need to address as a country.
I suppose, how can a government says this? I've heard it so many times, it's not funny now, this is the most important relationship to the Prime Minister. Aren't the victims being re-victimized, I suppose, having to go through this all again?
It has to be said how horrific the crimes are that are at the heart of the St. Anne's Residential School court cases. Decades of what any of us would call torture, institutionalized pedophilia, people in the highest level of responsibility inflicting the worst abuse of power and ruining generations of families. So how on earth the government, the Canadian government, could allow itself to be characterized in any way as not on the side of the families and not doing everything to bring the real criminals to justice here? It's hands raised to my colleague Charlie Angus. He's been fighting the hard fight on this with the families and with the victims for such a long time. This should have been easy for the government, and that it hasn't is a real betrayal of their promise.
So on that, like the most important, or there's their number one relationship, we see them use that line all the time. It seems to be that it is the most important when they can use First Nations to get something that they want. We've seen the Prime Minister go down to Washington and on the world stage make large, tell the world how well Canada was treating its First Nations, and yet here at home they didn't have the decency to even do any consultation on the northern drilling ban or the tanker ban on the West Coast. The northern drilling moratorium, for example, they gave the premiers of both the Northwest Territories and the Nunavut a phone call 45 minutes in advance, right? So if it's the most important relationship, it seems to be when First Nations want the things that they're advocating for, that the government is advocating for, but when the government doesn't want to listen to them, then suddenly that doesn't seem to be a big priority any longer.
You know, in my own riding, Snamo First Nation has got some challenges with port governance. Federal Port Authority, they wrote to the ministers 6 months ago saying, can you help us with this, or are there some other models? Not even the courtesy of a reply. And yesterday in question period, I asked the Prime Minister, why is he continuing to shut Native Women's Association of Canada out of the First Minister's meetings? It's been 4 times now that they thought that they should be at the table, and they haven't been. They've been shut out, including the First Minister's meetings on Monday. You know, major Ottawa, provincial, territorial, federal meeting on human rights. Native Women's Association of Canada should have been there. And when I asked why not, the Prime Minister said, that is just not true. And what he said was not true. I mean, show me the invitation list. NWAC says they've been doing this hard work for 10 years. They say they want to be included in the meetings, and they keep having their requests to be invited rebuffed. So the Prime Minister's wrong, and he's a hypocrite.
I'm just going to switch gears a little bit and bring up the issue of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Government said it's going to back Romeo Saganesh's private members bill. The NDP must be happy. Now, I know 2 weeks ago in committee, when the two Ministers Philpott and Bennett, were there, your colleague Cathy McLeod had some concerns about the legal scope of UNDRIP.
Yeah.
What are the concerns of your party?
Well, particularly around Section 19 of Article 19 of UNDRIP, free, prior, and informed consent. We still don't have any clarity on what the government thinks that means. I know that Romeo Saganesh has outlined particularly what he thinks that means, and so our questions are always about what does that mean? Does that mean that there is a veto? And both of the ministers acknowledged that there was not a veto, but that still, to some degree, that is going to be the biggest challenge of implementing UNDRIP. Our position has always been that in Canada, our laws are to be reflected in UNDRIP, and we will use it as a framework, but it's not necessarily even possible to just like implement UNDRIP as Canadian law. It's not that kind of a document necessarily.
Do you agree with that?
You know, I traveled to Norway a few years ago with a delegation of other Canadian businesses and leaders. On the topic of why are Norwegians not out in the street fighting pipelines the way Canadians do, especially on the BC coast. We met with a representative of the Sami Parliament. So Norway's got the same history of deep discrimination against Indigenous people, residential schools, trying to eradicate culture, the same experience as Canada did. But once they kind of saw the error of their ways, they moved fast. And within their country, they've got their own Sami Indigenous Parliament, which actually spans 3 countries. I mean, it's amazingly complicated. So I asked the Sami representative, what happens with resource development, the way that your community, the Indigenous leadership is consulted? You know, are you consulted and check a box and move on? Do you have a veto? He couldn't even understand the premise of my question. This is such a completely different mindset. And this, you know, European countries have implemented and embraced UNDRIP in a way, you know, far ahead of how the New World has. So he said, finally, he said, if the Sami were opposed to a project, why would it go ahead? And then he said, but the responsibility is also on us to work together to find solutions. And then he was able to point specifically to a piece of mining legislation that had been in the parliament. Sami parliament had said, and in fact the whole Norwegian parliament put the brakes on the thing. Now they're working together, or I mean this is 4 years ago. At this point we had the conversation. Now we're working together to try to find solutions and find another way for it to move forward. So we can look at other examples about non-Indigenous and Indigenous governments working together without even talking about the concept of a veto. But you know, as the language and as some of the resource decisions in Canada are happening right now, whether it's Site C or Kinder Morgan, we've obviously got some growing up to do as a country for us to live up to our commitments to First Nations.
Of course, Mr. Viersen, you represent an oil-producing province.
Yeah.
I'm sure your constituency must be very concerned about this. How concerned do you think people are about this stopping oil and gas projects?
Yeah, so the oil and gas is a big part of my riding, but I also have 14 First Nations in my riding, and so that it's a balancing act, or it's a relationship thing, right? That's really what it all comes down to. And believe me, the First Nations in my neck of the woods, they thrive on the oil and gas development that happens in their backyards, and they all participate in it. And so they themselves are concerned about what happens when 33 First Nations in Alberta sign on to the Northern Gateway pipeline, and it's stopped by 1 or 2 at the end of the line around Kitimat. That was their frustration that I hear from them, and so that's where is how is it represented? Who gets like what does it mean by free, prior, and informed consent, and who is all represented in that? And how are these decisions made? That's what we need to get to. And to Sheila's point, it's a relationship thing. It's something we have to see that we need to work together on all of these things. That's our big question on that particular article is how does free, prior, and informed consent happen in the Canadian context? No, I'm not familiar with the Norway perspective necessarily, but one of the things that strikes me is just the fact that Norway is a lot smaller country and may have a more homogenous population. In Canada, we have a very vast territory, vast country, and several different Indigenous populations within the country. Just going with the major 3 of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, how are they all going to be represented in that? How is the free, prior, and informed consent given? That's really what we're after.
Okay, well, we can continue with this. Hopefully next time we'll have Liberal representation. But I hope you enjoy the Christmas holidays, your break, and we'll see you guys again in, I guess, 6 weeks or so.
That's right.
Thank you to the whole APTN crew for the work you do.
Oh, thank you.
And Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas. And Merry Christmas to everybody out there. After the break, we'll have Regional Chief Isadore Day, and he'll talk to us about his concerns over the upcoming cannabis legislation. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. By next July, the sale and use of marijuana in Canada will be legal. In Ontario, you have to be 19 to buy it at government-run retailers. Taxes of its sale will be 75% to the provinces and 25% to Ottawa. However, Ontario's Regional Chief Isadore Day has deep concerns over the implications of legal pot. Last week, Day and Quebec Regional Chief Ghislain Picard struck a committee to look into the issue. Chief Day joins me now via Skype. Welcome to Nation to Nation. What is your main concern or your biggest concern with the proposed cannabis legislation?
Well, the fact that most jurisdictions across the country, including provinces and municipalities, right from the get-go, they've indicated that it's happening relatively quick. But we know that one of the things that the federal government has done was they put the carrot out in front of this, and they've struck a deal here just the other day that they would be giving 75% excise tax to the provinces, and we know for sure that the municipalities are part of that. First Nations are not part of that. We're not part of the walking in the legislation. So we haven't been part of forming our position and our concerns with regard to how that's being set out. And because it's such a huge societal shift in Canada, First Nations will be impacted.
You want to say on how it's sold on reserve, are you proposing retailers in communities?
Well, let's not kid ourselves here. Many of our folks in our communities, depending on where they are, so let's just take the northern communities for starts. Those communities that have a lack of policing services, health services, they've obviously become pretty consistent in messaging that they're not ready. There are a number of communities that do have access to certain services, and the big thing that they're looking at is the potential economy behind this. And what they're saying is that we would like to participate in the economy. So, let's not kid ourselves. Our people are going to want their share of the economy on this. And the dispensaries that you're seeing in many communities pop up, I suggest that we need to have a close look at that, because they're going to want to be part of the economy, just like the tobacco industry.
There, of course, is already a black market in alcohol and drugs. How will things be different when this plan goes through?
Well, I think it's really important, and that's a really good question, Todd, because I think that the federal and provincial governments need to examine this backward approach, and this might be the demise, and this might be conflict, because the reality is what might be perceived as the illicit market now. All these dispensaries across the country, they just may come banging on First Nations doors to invest in what they see now as a gray area, would be considered possibly the gray market. And we shouldn't be doing business like that. We need to avoid, what we've seen play out in the tobacco industry. But one thing is for certain, that if our community members that are ready to do business, they're going to want to be legitimate. They're going to want to be recognized. And we as First Nation leadership, we need to support them. If they have a safe product, if they have a safe way of doing this, then, we need to ensure that we promote the place for them in the space in the economy for these First Nation entrepreneurs.
You also talked that you want First Nations to control the sale and have their own plan. How would that be different than the province of Ontario, for example?
Well, I think it's going to be important, again, to recognize the backward approach that government has taken. I think some of the things that are playing itself out with regard to the 40 stores that will be earmarked for July 18th in Ontario, these are LCBO models. And, the reality is if First Nations want to participate, we're obviously not going to fit into the LCBO model. And the government has to recognize that the lack of the preparation for our participation will come down to one key question. Why didn't the province of Ontario earmark a set-aside for First Nations to be involved in this industry? It is really going to become a challenge, and I think one that is a real hot potato that is in the hands of the Ontario and the federal government now.
Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott said that she discussed this. She sat down and discussed this with some of the chiefs at the AFN Special Assembly last week. Can you tell us what was discussed?
Well, I have to acknowledge Minister Philpott, and I'm going to think that this cannabis file will become, one of the defining challenges that she will be faced with as we begin to look at the true and immediate impacts of the legislation, and then how First Nations jurisdictions will be taken into account as the federal and provincial governments roll out their plan. The minister has indicated that she wants to support issues around health. She understands that there will be jurisdictional issues. I don't think she quite understands the depth and the breadth of just how widespread the challenges will be, and the fact that the federal government hadn't included us into the front end of this, that she's going to have some real issues and some pretty hot issues to deal with going forward.
Of course, we're only a little over 6 months away when this is supposed to be implemented. I mean, how realistic is that you can delay this implementation to get First Nations consent?
Well, what we're hoping is that the federal government will acknowledge and recognize the resolution that was passed, the last resolution at the SCA last week, and we're hoping that Canada takes a very serious look at the excise tax issue, as well as the resolution to, institute some sort of a delay from the First Nation perspective. Listen, we're not saying that Canada or the provinces and territories should delay the implementation within the mainstream. But as it pertains to our First Nations, we feel that government needs to take another year. They need to work with us directly. There needs to be a fair share. We need set aside, and we need investments in community safety, governance, areas of commerce, and access to this part of the economy, which is a new emerging economy as part of Canada's GDP. So bring us in, do it fairly, and stop doing this in a backward fashion.
Okay, on that note, I want to thank you, Chief Day, for speaking to me.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after another short break. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Earlier today, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett made an announcement on a National Council for Reconciliation. It'll be a body that will report back to the government on the progress of reconciliation. Treaty 6 Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild explained its importance.
I've been to over 100 communities since the report was tabled, and I'm very, very encouraged by what I see and what I feel is happening across the country. Very different activities, but from different places in society. So for me, I think we've made some very, very important progress, but what we need is the council. We need the monitoring of all this good activity and perhaps some coordination, because there's a lot of things that are happening where we can learn from each other. So I think we've come a long way.
If you missed any part of tonight's show or any others, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca. Todd Lamoran, have a great evening.